So now we have our next part. Are we going to have someone said something, someone thought something, or somebody did something? And now, from the story that was told, the dad came over and pulled the branches aside and pulled out his foot. So we're just going to put the dad here. Maybe here's some hands. And here's the foot. And here's the bush. So he pulled those branches apart so I could pull out my foot. What do? We need to form this sentence. How do we do that? We go back and reread. When we come to this sentence, what do we say? Who's doing the action? What did they do? So let's go back. One day at the lake, I darted around tall trees, climbed up a big rock, and then jumped into a thick bush. Snap, crackle, my foot got tangled in its branches. I cried, "Help! I've been swallowed by a bush." Who's doing the action? My dad. What did your dad do? My dad pulled apart the branches so I could pull out my foot. I keep saying pulled. Woo, woo, woo. Redundant, please, redundant, please. I can't keep saying pulled. So what happened? He pulled out your foot so you were free. Okay, so now let's try it. Who's doing the action? My dad. What did he do? He pulled apart the branches so my foot was free. What's happening? Redundant, please, redundant, please. Good writers don't keep using the same words. I said pulled, pulled. You don't want to keep saying the same word over and over again. Let's go back and fix that. Take away one of the pulled. So we have, who's doing the action? My dad. What did he do? He pulled apart the branches. And then what? And then my foot was still caught in the branches or free. So again, I give two choices if they can't come up with the language. Free. All right, so let's say it. My dad pulled apart the branches and my foot was free. I'm just going to start with my. We're not going to put a transition there. My story's done. So I don't have any more actions. I'm free. We have our story opening. We have our actions, actions, actions. The story is done. So when our story is done, we can have a secret formula for our story closing. And our secret formula is TCR. And then I have the kids go, what does that mean? Thank you for asking. T is for transition. And we know what are transition? Fancy words that move you from one action to the next action. What are transitions? Fancy words that move you from one action to the next action. So we need to get from this action to our ending action. So our fancy words, what we can use there is in the end, finally, looking back, after that day, once I was safe. So there's a bunch of different ways to end our story. Maybe I'm going to use looking back. How about we do that? Who's doing the action? Who's reflecting? So character is I am. R is reflection. Reflection means I'm going to go back in the story, and after what happened to me, I'm going to reflect and I'm going to tell you what I thought, what I felt, or what I learned. So reflection means I, or the main character, goes back in the story and thinks to themselves, what did I learn? What did I wish? Or how did I feel about these actions after they happened to me? So once this event, this experience happened to me, what did I wish? Like a thinking bubble. Think or learn. What did I wish? Like a thinking bubble. Touch your forehead like you're thinking and say, what did I learn? Or touch your heart. What did I feel? You can all say, looking back, let's try all three. Looking back, I felt lucky to have such a strong dad. Looking back, I learned, don't jump off big rock. Looking back, I wished I could grease my boots so I wouldn't get stuck into anything when I run around in the woods. We have all these different ways that we could say this. The kids talk to each other and they're going to choose the one they like, or, and this is what you really want, you want them to come up with their own. I'm going to go back and I'm going to have, looking back, I learned my dad, maybe I'll show muscles here. I have a really strong dad. So looking back, I learned to always be with my dad because he's really strong and can save me. We have our ideas We have our story opening, our actions, and the story is done. And we didn't know where we were going in this story until it was finished. And what are we going to do? Once we have all of our ideas here, we will go back, we will get our red pens or crayons and say, punctuation time. We already put the punctuation on the first sentence, but let's go to the next sentence. Snap, crackle. Wait a minute. Emphatic statement. Those are sound effects. They can stay on their own. So we're going to capitalize snap, crackle, and put an exclamation point. How do we start this next sentence? Snap, crackle, my foot. So what word are we going to use? My. Capitalize my here. Foot got tangled in the branches. I cried. Let's just put our I cried, our comma, and make sure we have all of our punctuation with the red marks so that we can remember when we go back to check that we have those capitals and those punctuation marks on our paper. We have our my dad. Oh, this isn't a transition. We just started the sentence with my, because you don't always need a transition. My dad pulled apart the branches and my foot was free, period. Looking back, so we have our L. Looking back, that's my transition, so I need a comma. I learned to always go camping, or I learned my dad was a very strong man and could save me, period. So we have our quotation marks, we have our punctuation marks, our capitalization. Last thing we want to do is we want to go back. We already did this with the first sentence, but do we want to go back and add fancy words? So let's look at our second sentence. My foot got tangled in its branches. What would be important? Probably branches. Snap, crackle, my foot got tangled in. What kind of branches would my foot get tangled in? Well, was there just one or a bunch of them? A bunch of them. So let's put a bunch. So we'll put bunch. Snap, crackle, my foot got tangled in a bunch of branches. We have I cried, help, I've been swallowed by a bush. Maybe we can describe bush if we do that. Maybe I've been swallowed by a hungry bush. That could be funny. It depends if you want to write that or not. And what kind of dad would come and pull apart a branch? So is dad important to describe? Yes. Pull apart the branches and my foot was free. Ooh, maybe I should describe my foot too. That seems important to describe. So what kind of dad would pull apart the branches? Am I going to use 5 senses, his personality, or would I use his emotions? What kind of personality? I think we're going to describe his personality. My kind dad. Let's do that. My kind dad pulled apart the branches and my what kind of foot would be free? My swollen foot was free. Looking back, I learned my dad was brave and was always there to save me. So we have our describing words, we have our punctuation, we have all of our actions, we have our story opening actions, our story closing, and the kids are going to rehearse it over and over again. We've been rehearsing it over and over and over again as we've been planning this. The kids are rehearsing their organizer over and over. The children who are fluently rehearsing it, and remember, every time they rehearse it, they can change it up a little as long as it sticks with the story and it makes sense. They don't need to say the exact words that you've been saying. Every time I say it a little differently. I'm showing them I'm thinking about the picture, and when I say it differently, it's because I can make the sentence better. I'm revising through my rehearsals. So we keep orally rehearsing it over and over and over, and then what happens? I tell children who are fluently saying it with ease to go ahead and start writing. So they start writing, and they have a writing paper with a rectangular square, a yellow rectangular square, so that they always indent. Eventually, they don't need the square. Once they just have practiced so many times of indenting, they don't need this anymore. They just do it naturally. But you don't want them to not indent and then later have them fix it, because then they practice doing it wrong and it's really difficult to unchange that habit. So you always have them do it correctly. So now you have your paper, they're orally rehearsing it. How do they orally rehearse it? They have their paper, their writing paper next to their planner. They say their sentence, then they write it down. While they're writing down their sentence, they say it as they write. Then they go back, they repeat the sentence that they just wrote, they repeat the whole organizer. So they did the story opening, they wrote it down. And as they write it down and say it. Then they go back, they say the story opening, and now they're rehearsing and practicing the second sentence. Once it sounds pretty good, they go back, they reread their story opening and say that second sentence. You keep doing this. They're talking, talking, talking. They're rehearsing, rehearsing as they write, over and over again throughout their paper. When they're finished, they count all the different punctuation, they match it up. Once you have dialogue, it's better for them to do it sentence by sentence. And what I mean by that is this. First, you can just have them count how many stops, periods, and exclamation points, and if there were question marks, were in their writing. Then they go back and count and make sure that that's there. But the next thing that I usually do once they get to this level, because there's so much punctuation, is I have them do touch points, and that's where they're going to touch the first word of each sentence. So they touch one, then they touch the period at the end of that sentence. Now they say the sentence, and then they go to their writing and they make sure they have the capital there. They say the sentence and make sure that it ends with the stop. And then they also go back and see in that where they've touch point that sentence, do they have 1, 2, 3 commas? Do they have the 3 commas? They go back and check and count. Then they go to the next sentence and they touch point them so that they're actually identifying that sentence and they isolate it. So then they check for the capital and stop, and if there's any commas in there, then they're going to check for that as well. What if in my sentence I had some capitalization, like there was a proper noun? We would color code that red, and then they would go back and make sure that they had that capital in their sentence as well. So they would isolate these sentences in their writing, look at their organizer for the punctuation and make sure it matches in their writing. There's our organizer, here's our plan. Now, when I did this with you, I knew my story because it was a personal narrative. If it's a personal narrative, you tell the story, then you follow the steps to write it down. If it's an imaginative story, then what you do is follow the steps and it'll create a story. Either way, these steps work. Now that we've finished with this activity, go back, grab a new piece of paper, see if you can follow the steps, and write your own story. Good luck, and I hope you enjoy it.